Hello. So I'd like to begin with a question that might unsettle us here. But how can a wealthy nation like the UK, who are sort of one of the richest in history, still have poverty today on this scale? Poverty here isn't really rare. It isn't hidden. It's in our schools, our hospitals, our workplaces, and yet we treat it as normal. So, what I'd like to do today is to unpack what poverty really means, not just through definitions, but through real people's experiences as well. Because when we forget the human stories, we can forget the human cost as well. Absolute poverty then. So, absolute poverty really means struggling to meet what our basic needs are, really, the foundations of our survival. I'll use an example to sort of illustrate this here. Let's use a lady called, let's call her Sarah. So she works two part-time jobs, both on 0-hour contracts. She earns enough to keep the lights on, but not enough to heat her home, say, all winter. So she tells a reporter, I sleep in my coat so the kids can have the blankets. So this is absolute poverty here. So there is absolute poverty in modern Britain, but it's a bit of a sort of contentious issue. We're not in a war zone here. We're not in a developing not in a developing nation, but we're here. And the most painful part of this is none of this is inevitable. It's a sign of a system that accepts suffering almost as an acceptable side effect of its design, of the system's design. So we can see here that, it being, lacking enough income or resources to meet basic, it's all about the basic needs here, isn't it? Food, shelter, heating, clothing. Severe deprivation. So when we look at relative poverty, this is sort of comparing, contrasting. It defines poverty in comparison to typical incomes in society. So it's all about inequality, really, about how far behind some families fall compared to the rest of society. I think, again, we'll use another example here to illustrate this. Consider a boy called, we'll call him Daniel. So say he goes to school, where many children have, the iPhones, branded trainers. They go to after-school clubs. Daniel doesn't. His family can't afford the school trips, so he stays at home. Now, he says nothing, but he feels the difference, doesn't he? He's got to. So we can see here that relative poverty is kind of quiet. It doesn't always show up in emergency, say, statistics, but it shows up in, say, a child's confidence or mental health. So it's definitely a real thing here. It tells us who is allowed. It tells us who is allowed to take part in society and who's forced to watch from, say, the sidelines. It says here, it captures inequality and changing living standards over time. relative poverty shows how far poorer households lag behind the average in resources and lifestyle. So it's sort of keeping up with the Joneses, isn't it? That's kind of put it in a nutshell. Social material deprivation. Right, so I mean, poverty can include what does include material deprivation, lacking goods or services that can be seen as ordinary for society. It may reflect inability to participate in normal social life. So it's social exclusion. It kind of reveals the everyday reality of poverty. Let's use another example. But say a single father, we'll call him Tony. So his washing machine broke last year, he couldn't afford a new one, so for months he washed his daughter's school uniform in the bath. He told researchers, every decision I make is a compromise. So it's sort of taking from one hand and putting back with the other, almost. This is the constant grind of poverty, the hidden labour that the rest of society never really sees. It's not just about lacking money here, it's about lacking choices, lacking stability, lacking breathing room, really. Yeah, a broader measure combines income poverty with deprivation and other needs. Structural explanations of poverty. Structural view argues poverty arises from economic and social systems. Early 1900s, low pay, insecure work did cause widespread poverty. Post-war welfare state also expansion reduced poverty. Since the 1980s, poverty has risen due to deindustrialisation and weakened welfare. To kind of add to that, structural explanations point to the systems that produce poverty. Think of former industrial towns, say Sunderland or parts of Glasgow, where whole industries have disappeared. You know, the jobs, the secure jobs they've had for years and years or decades have just gone. Opportunities have dried up. Families, you know, they'd worked hard for generations, suddenly had nowhere to go. Not because they failed, just because the economy moved on without them. And it's the same story today with insecure work, unaffordable rents, which is a huge thing, and underfunded services. If the structure is kind of tilted, individuals can't simply try harder to stand straight, shall we say. Moving on. So, behavioural explanations of poverty. Cultural explanations link poverty to behaviours, attitudes or values. Some argue poverty persists due to lack of motivation or poor choices. Others say norms can reinforce poverty across generations. Cultural explanations blame the poor themselves, their habits, their values, their communities. But again, we'll use another example to highlight. Take the case of a mother, we'll call her Leanne. She grew up in poverty. She's raising 3 children in temporary accommodation. And then she's criticised for buying cheap junk food. She works unpredictable hours and has no freezer, no reliable fridge, and no time to cook. The choices, they're not cultural flaws, they're adaptations to stress, insecurity, and limited options. But when society judges people like Leanne, it conveniently avoids addressing the root cause around them. Individual explanations of poverty. Individual explanations say poverty is about personal choices, poor budgeting, lack of motivation, bad planning. But consider the example of Jamal. He works full time in a warehouse, his wages cover the rent, but only just. After his bills, he's got about £14-15 left each week. So you've got to ask yourself, how do you budget your way out of that? How do you save? How do you invest in training or education? You can't. Individual explanations make poverty sound like a lifestyle, when really you could see it as a trap, one that tightens the harder you try to escape it. Yeah, this view places responsibility on the individual. Evolution of poverty in Britain. If we sort of look back over the last century, we can see clear patterns. In the early 1900s, poverty was everywhere. People like the families studied by Charles Booth and Seabohm Rowntree lived in severe hardship. Then came reforms, pensions, labour laws, the NHS, social housing. Poverty fell, but not just by accident, but because society invested in people. Post-World War II welfare state reduced poverty and equality. But then the 1980s brought about a different story. Factories were closing, secure jobs vanished, inequality grew. Basically, the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. Communities like former mining towns are still living the consequences today, not because they failed, but because the safety nets beneath them were removed. Key historical events and their impact. Early poverty surveys reveal the truth. Poverty wasn't caused by laziness, but by social conditions. The Great Depression showed how quickly millions can fall when the economy collapses. The post-war welfare state, it did show how quickly millions can rise when society invests in fairness. And the economic shifts of the 1980s reshaped the UK, shifting wealth upward and leaving certain regions permanently disadvantaged. History is clear. Poverty grows when political priorities shift away from people. Public perceptions and policy. The early 1900s surveys shocked the public. Post-war optimism suggests poverty was solved. Public perception shapes policy even more than evidence does. When society blames individuals, governments cut the support. When society understands poverty as structural, governments build the safety nets. 1960s to 70s evidence revealed ongoing deprivation. A striking case comes from the 2010s. Many families using food banks were working full-time, yet the narrative in politics and media still frame poverty as a personal failure. This mismatch between perception and reality is one of the biggest obstacles to change. So, to summarise, poverty has got multiple definitions. Structural, cultural and individual models offer different explanations. Poverty levels have shifted across the century, and economic, political and social changes have shaped the outcomes. What do these stories tell us? Absolute poverty shows a struggle to survive. Relative poverty shows a struggle to belong. Material deprivation shows a struggle to cope. Structural, cultural and individual explanations all shape the lens that we look through. But some lenses distort far more than they clarify. The cases we've talked about aren't rare, they aren't unusual, they're happening every single day in every part of the UK. But here's the final message. Poverty persists not because we lack resources, but because we lack the will to design a society without it. If we change our priorities, we change the future. And people like Sarah, Daniel, Tony, Leanne and Jamal don't just survive, they live. Thank you.